The prairie wind carried secrets in its whistle, bending the grass flat as though the earth itself bowed beneath the weight of time. In the late 1800s, life in the small American villages that dotted the frontier was built on hard work, fear of the unknown, and whispered tales that moved quicker than any horse. These settlements looked peaceful from afar, whitewashed chapels, smoke curling from chimneys, children's laughter chasing dogs down dusty lanes. Yet just beyond the edge of town, where the shadows of the hills lengthened and the caves gaped like silent mouths, mystery and danger were never far away. Folks said no good ever came from wandering too far from the village, especially near the caves where flickers of firelight had sometimes been seen at night. But one woman was about to prove those old tales weren't just idle gossip. She had always been different. In a town where most women lived tethered to routines, sewing by lamplight, minding children, cooking bread, she preferred long walks past the fields, her shoes brushing through the tall grass as if searching for something unnamed. Widowed too soon, with no children to occupy her time, she carried an air of solitude that the villagers didn't understand. Some pitied her, some avoided her, but she never let their stares weigh her down. If anything, her loneliness had sharpened her eyes and ears, making her notice details others miss, the way the wind shifted before a storm, or how the ground sometimes carried a faint vibration when horses moved at night beyond sight. One late afternoon, as the sun melted low behind the hills, she followed a trail she had never taken before. Something in her chest urged her forward, though she couldn't have explained why. The silence was heavy, broken only by the crunch of her boots and the occasional crow calling from a fence post. Her path bent toward a cave at the base of a ridge, a dark hollow that seemed to breathe with the earth itself. Most villagers would have turned back. She lingered. Something about that cave called to her, though it wasn't fear or even curiosity. It was more like recognition, as though the shadows inside carried a story she had been waiting her whole life to hear. When she stepped past the threshold, cool air wrapped around her. Her hand grazed the rock wall for balance, and faint echoes carried through the cavern, almost like whispers. Then, with her eyes adjusting to the dim glow, she froze. She wasn't alone. At first she thought the figure before her was a vision conjured by her tired mind. A man stood bound to a wooden beam, his wrists tied with rough rope, his body scarred and marked as if he had fought both men and beasts. His skin glistened in the flicker of firelight from a small torch wedged into the rock. Long braids framed his face, and his dark eyes burned with both defiance and pain. He did not cry out or plead. He simply stared at her, his chest rising slow and steady, as though daring her to come closer. She could tell immediately he was Apache. The villagers spoke often of the Apache tribes, sometimes with fear, sometimes with scorn, always with a tangle of rumor. Stories painted them as fierce, untamed, and dangerous. Yet standing before this bound warrior, she saw none of the wild cruelty the townsfolk described. She saw a man brought low, held captive, his spirit restrained but not broken, and something inside her shifted, as though her own loneliness had finally found its echo. Her first instinct was to run, to retreat before anyone discovered her in the cave with him. If the villagers knew, they would call her foolish or worse, traitorous for even laying eyes on him. But her feet wouldn't move. She could feel his gaze anchoring her, steady and unflinching. It was as though he was silently asking her the question no one else had ever dared. Would she turn away like everyone else, or would she see him as more than what the world claimed him to be? Her throat tightened, but she stepped closer, her palms damp with nerves. "Who did this to you?" she whispered, though she knew he might not understand her words. He gave no reply, but his eyes softened, just slightly, in a way that told her he understood more than she expected. She realized then that it didn't matter whether or not they shared a language. What passed between them was deeper than words. Than that moment, she noticed something else. Around his neck hung a piece of cloth, torn and faded, not of Apache design. It looked like it once belonged to someone else's, perhaps taken, perhaps gifted, perhaps a memory. The mystery of it deepened her resolve. Whoever he was, his story was not just one of war and survival, but of ties to a world beyond the cave. Her heart pounded. She knew she had only moments before dusk swallowed the hills, and someone from the village might come searching. Yet the thought of leaving him bound there, nameless and forgotten, was unbearable. She could not free him yet, not without understanding more, not without risking everything, but she could do one thing. She could give him back a piece of what had been stripped from him, identity. She stepped closer until she could feel the warmth radiating off his skin. And though his arms were bound high above him, she placed her hand gently against his forearm, a silent promise. "You are not just a prisoner," she said softly. "You are more than they think. If they will not call you by name, then I will." She hesitated, searching her memory for something fitting, something that would honor the strength and quiet fire in his eyes. And though the name formed on her lips unbidden, it felt right, as if it had waited for her to speak it aloud. "You are no shadow," she whispered. "From this day you have a home, and you will have a name." His jaw tightened, his gaze never breaking from hers. But in his eyes flickered something new, hope, cautious but real. Like the first spark of fire and dry kindling, the cave around them seemed to grow darker as night fell outside. And with it, the weight of decisions yet to come pressed heavily upon her. She knew the risk of helping him could destroy everything she had left in the village. She knew whispers would spread, and suspicion would follow. But as she turned to leave, her heart was steady. The bound warrior was no longer a stranger in her eyes. He was a story yet unwritten, a life she could not abandon. Behind her, the ropes creaked as he shifted, watching her every step until the shadows swallowed her figure. She paused at the mouth of the cave, torn between the safety of returning home and the pull of returning to him. The night wind carried a chill, but it also carried a question she could not yet answer. Was she about to lose everything, or find the one thing she had been searching for all her life? And in the darkness of the cave, the warrior waited, his silence filled with promises of danger, of trust, and of something neither of them yet dared to name. The next morning, the woman woke to the familiar creak of the wooden floor beneath her bed, the faint scent of smoke from the neighbors' chimneys drifting in through the cracks in the shutters. The village was already stirring, men leading oxen to the fields, children running errands, women sweeping porches and hanging laundry across ropes that sagged between posts. To anyone looking at her from outside, her life was ordinary, nothing more than another widow carrying on in the rhythm expected of her. But inside her chest, the weight of what she had seen the night before pressed like a secret too heavy to ignore. She tried to go about her tasks, feeding the hens, kneading bread, scrubbing a pot that had long since lost its shine. Yet the image of the warrior's eyes stayed with her. They had not pleaded, yet they had spoken to her as clearly as if he had shouted across the cave. It unsettled her, not because she was afraid, but because she could not understand why she felt so drawn to a man who had every reason to hate the people of her village. By midday, she found herself glancing toward the hills more often than she should have, her fingers pausing over her work. What if someone else stumbled upon that cave? What if they found him and decided he was worth nothing more than a problem to be solved with violence? The thought twisted in her gut. She told herself she had no duty to him, no reason to put her own standing in the village at risk. And yet when the shadows grew long and the air cooled with the coming evening, she found her feet moving again toward the ridge, each step quieter than the last, as if she were moving against her own will. The cave greeted her with silence, but it was not empty. He was still there, bound, though his eyes seemed less guarded when they found her shape in the dim light. She carried a cloth sack with her this time, though she had tried to convince herself all day she wouldn't. Inside was a piece of bread and a small flask of water. She set them down on the dirt floor without a word, not daring to untie him, but unwilling to leave him suffering. He watched her closely, his gaze lingering on the bread before lifting again to her face. She hesitated, then tore off a piece and held it near his mouth. For a moment she thought he would refuse out of pride, but hunger had its own voice. He accepted it, his teeth brushing her fingertips, his eyes steady on hers the whole time. It was the smallest exchange, and yet it bound them in a way stronger than the ropes around his wrists. She spoke then, though her words were halting, uncertain. "I don't know your name. I don't know why you're here like this, but I can't leave you to die in silence." He gave no answer, only a faint nod, the firelight catching in his dark braids. She thought she saw gratitude in his expression, but it was layered with something deeper wariness, perhaps, or the kind of caution that comes from living too long on the edge of betrayal. That night she returned home uneasy. If anyone noticed her absence, they said nothing, but whispers had a way of spreading faster than smoke in the village. She knew it was only a matter of time before someone wondered what had drawn her out to the hills so often. To distract herself, she listened to the stories told around the hearth that week. Men spoke of raids of cattle driven off in the night, of arrows found near the streams. They blamed the Apache, though none had actually seen who was responsible. Fear was easier to feed than truth, and suspicion gave them a target for their unrest. Her heart tightened each time she heard the word Apache spoken with bitterness. If they only knew one of their supposed enemies was bound less than a mile from their homes, what would they do? She could picture it clearly, a group of men with rifles, marching to the cave, ending his life without hesitation. And what part would she play? The thought chilled her, because she could not imagine standing aside any longer. Over the next days she visited him again and again, always with food or water, always with caution. Slowly, she began to learn the lines of his face, the way his expression shifted when he was listening, the slight softening in his jaw when he seemed to trust her presence. Though he still did not speak in her tongue, there were moments when his silence said more than words. He would watch her hands, sometimes following the motion of her lips, as though trying to understand. Once, when she left a small piece of fabric from her apron near him, turned his head and closed his eyes, as though holding on to the faint comfort of it, her visits became the rhythm of her days. Yet the risk only grew heavier. One afternoon, as she returned, she noticed hoofprints near the cave entrance that were not her own. Her breath caught in her throat as she crouched to study them. They were fresh, and there were more than one set. Someone else had been near. She hurried inside, her heart thundering, but the warrior was still there, his eyes sharp, his body tense as if he too had sensed danger. She could feel the question in his stare. Had she brought others? She shook her head quickly, whispering, "No, not me." And though he could not understand all her words, something in her tone seemed to soothe him. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams above her bed, listening to the distant howl of coyotes. She wondered who else had been in the cave and whether they would return. She wondered what kind of enemy had left him bound there in the first place. It did not feel like the work of her fellow villagers. They were too fearful to drag an Apache warrior into their midst. No, this had been done by men with another purpose. Soldiers, perhaps, or outlaws who had crossed paths with him and decided he was worth breaking. The mystery gnawed at her, each possibility more troubling than the last, and still questions about him filled her mind. Did he have a family searching for him? Was he a leader among his people, or a lone wanderer like herself? Did he carry memories of battles fought, or of quiet moments long before violence touched his life? She longed to ask, but the silence between them was both barrier and bond, as the days folded into weeks. She began to notice a change in herself as much as in him. She walked with a new awareness, her ears tuned to every sound, her eyes watching the horizon as if expecting the world to shift at any moment. The village no longer felt like the whole of her life. It felt smaller, more fragile, a place balanced on the edge of secrets, but her secret could not remain hers forever. One evening, as she carried a loaf wrapped in cloth toward the cave, she heard voices behind her. She froze, heart hammering, as two men from the village rode by on horseback, their laughter carrying on the wind. They did not see her hidden among the brush, but their words cut sharp. They spoke of searching the hills, of rumors of movement near the caves, of how the town must remain vigilant. She waited until their shapes vanished down the trail before hurrying forward, her hands trembling. When she reached the cave, the warrior was still waiting, his eyes watchful. She placed the loaf before him, but her voice was low and urgent. "They're looking," she whispered. "They'll find you if I don't do something." He tilted his head, studying her with a calmness that only deepened her unease. Did he not fear what might come? Or had he already accepted whatever fate awaited him? She could not tell. All she knew was that the choice she had been avoiding would soon demand an answer. For the first time since she had found him, she pressed her hand to the ropes at his wrist, testing their strength. They were rough and unyielding, cutting into his skin. He watched her silently, and though he did not move, she felt the air between them tighten, charged with possibility. She pulled her hand back before she could decide, fear rising like a wall inside her. Freeing him meant betraying her village. Leaving him meant betraying herself. The firelight flickered across his face. She thought she saw the faintest trace of a smile, not of amusement, but of understanding. As though he knew her struggle, as though he had lived his life in the same clash of loyalty and longing. The night outside deepened, stars bright against the velvet sky. She stood at the cave's mouth again, torn by the same question as before. Would she walk away into the safety of the village, or step forward into the unknown, bound by a decision that could not be undone? And behind her, the warrior waited, silent, patient, his fate hanging in the balance of her next choice. The days grew shorter, and the chill of autumn pressed into the village. Smoke hung heavier in the air, and the chatter of neighbors seemed sharper, tinged with unease. People spoke of raids further west, of cattle disappearing, of riders seen at night where no riders should be. The talk always circled back to the Apache, though no one could prove the stories true. Fear made people restless. Restlessness often turned to anger. The woman moved among her neighbors with a careful face, offering polite smiles, nodding at greetings, keeping her hands busy. But inside, she carried a storm. Every visit to the cave bound her more tightly to the man she had found, though she still knew almost nothing about him. His silence was its own kind of language, steady and watchful. But she could feel something stronger beneath it, a fire contained, not extinguished. Each time she looked at the rope burns on his wrists, a question pulled at her. How long could she keep him hidden before someone else stumbled upon the cave? One afternoon, she lingered outside the general store, listening to the men gathered by the barrels. Their voices dropped low when they thought no one was listening, but she caught enough to make her blood run cold. 2 cattle had gone missing, and one man swore he had seen tracks in the hills. Another claimed to have spotted a firelight in the ridge at night. They spoke of sending out a search party before winter closed in. She stood frozen, her basket heavy in her hands, her heart pounding as though they had already discovered the truth. That night, she hurried to the cave. The torch inside sputtered low, but the warrior's eyes gleamed in the shadows. She pressed a hand to the rock wall, steadying herself. "They're searching," she whispered. "They're watching the hills. If they find you—" She didn't finish. His expression didn't change. But she noticed the slight way his shoulders lifted, as if acknowledging what he already expected. For the first time, though, he spoke not in words she fully understood, but in sounds shaped with meaning. His voice was deep, calm, carrying weight even through the barrier of language. She couldn't grasp the whole of it, but one word repeated itself, strong and clear: home. The sound of it lodged in her chest. Did he speak of his own home, somewhere beyond the hills, waiting for him? Or had he caught the thread of her promise that first night, when she told him he would have a name and a place? The ambiguity only deepened the bond between them, and with it, her fear of what would come if the village discovered him. Over the following days, she noticed another shift. It wasn't just the men speaking of raids. Women whispered too, their voices hushed as they washed clothes by the river or traded flour in the store. Some spoke of the widow who wandered too often, who vanished into the hills at odd hours. They wondered if grief had made her strange, or if she was chasing something she shouldn't. She heard her name murmured once, followed by a sharp silence when she entered the room. Suspicion had already begun its work, weaving threads of doubt into the minds of those around her. Back in the cave, the warrior seemed to sense her worry. He studied her face more closely now, as if measuring the weight she carried. One evening, when the wind howled against the rocks outside, she brought a blanket with her. She pressed it into his arms, her hands brushing the rope that bound him. His eyes softened, and for a moment she thought she saw gratitude break through his steady guard. That night, she left the cave with her heart heavy, not because of fear, but because she could no longer pretend he was just a stranger. Meanwhile, the search party formed. She overheard it by accident, standing behind a stack of grain sacks, while the blacksmith spoke. A group of men would ride out at dawn, rifles slung across their backs, determined to sweep the ridge and smoke out anyone hiding there. She felt her knees weaken, her breath catch in her throat. They were not looking for one man, they were looking for the idea of an enemy. But if they found him, their anger would need no further reason. That night she did not sleep. She rose before the first light touched the horizon, pulling her shawl tight against the cold, and hurried once more to the cave. The warrior looked at her with that same steady calm, but she could see in his eyes he knew something was different. She knelt beside him, her voice trembling. "They're coming. I don't know how much longer I can keep you hidden." For the first time, she pressed a small knife into his hands. The blade was worn, the handle chipped, but it was all she had. He studied it for a long moment, then looked back at her with an expression that made her chest ache. He did not cut the ropes. Instead, he placed the knife on the ground between them, as though telling her the choice was still hers. She left the cave that morning with the sound of hoofbeats in her ears, distant but drawing nearer. The men would comb the ridge, rifles gleaming in the sun. She hurried back to the village, forcing herself into the daily rhythm, though every moment stretched tight with fear. The search lasted 3 days. On the second night, she climbed the ridge under cover of darkness, heart in her throat, praying they had not already found him. When she slipped inside the cave, he was still there, still bound, still watching her with eyes that never wavered. Relief nearly brought her to tears, but she pressed it down, setting bread and water before him, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Back in the village, the tension thickened. The men returned with no clear answers, their anger sharpened by frustration. Some swore they had seen tracks leading away from the ridge. Others said they had found nothing but fox dens and coyote trails. The uncertainty only made the suspicion stronger, and through it all, she felt eyes on her, curious, watchful, waiting for her to falter. One evening, as the sky bled red with the setting sun, she sat by her small fire, staring into the flames. She thought of the warrior's silence, of the word home he had spoken, of the knife left untouched between them. She thought of the village, her life woven into its fabric, fragile though it was. And she thought of the choice pressing harder each day, to keep him bound in secret, or to free him and risk losing everything. But there was another shadow creeping closer, one she had not yet faced. Somewhere beyond the hills, someone must have tied him there. Someone had wanted him left in that cave. Whether they were soldiers, outlaws, or others of his own kind, they had not finished their story. And if they returned, they would bring with them a reckoning she could not yet imagine. As the fire crackled, she wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and stared at the dark line of the ridge against the stars. The secret she carried was no longer just a burden, it was a fuse burning slowly toward an end she could neither predict nor stop. And in the cave, the warrior waited still, bound by rope and silence, his fate tied as tightly to hers as the knots on his wrists. The nights grew longer, the winds sharper, and with every passing day, the air around the village felt heavier, as though everyone waited for something to break. The men spoke louder now, their suspicions sharpened by restlessness. And the women carried rumors like bundles of firewood, passing them from one doorstep to another. The talk of Apache raids had grown into something larger, an unease that could no longer be soothed by stories told at the hearth. Every rider on the horizon was questioned. Every shadow in the hills treated as a threat. The woman moved quietly through it all, her heart split between two worlds. In the village, she baked bread, patched torn sleeves, answered the occasional polite word with a nod. In the hills, she carried water, scraps of food, and her silence. Always returning to the cave where the bound warrior waited. Each time she found him still alive, a spark of relief lit inside her, though it burned quickly into fear. She could feel the storm tightening around them, and she knew that when it finally broke, there would be no safe ground left to stand on. The warrior seemed to sense it too. His eyes had changed, still steady, but sharper, alert in a way that told her he felt the danger pressing in. She noticed the way he tilted his head when sounds drifted through the cave's mouth, the way his muscles tensed when he caught movement in the dark. He had lived with danger all his life. She could see it in him. What unsettled her most was the way his gaze lingered on her, as if he knew she stood on the edge of a decision she could not avoid. The knife still lay hidden in the shadows near the rocks. She had not taken it back, and he had not used it. Its presence haunted her. Each time she saw it, she felt the question hanging heavy in the air, whose hand would finally set him free. One evening, she returned to the cave later than usual, her steps hurried and her chest tight. She had overheard men at the blacksmith's shop speaking of another search, this one larger and more determined. They had argued about where to begin, but their voices carried the same conclusion: they would sweep the ridge again, this time with no intention of returning empty-handed. Their anger was no longer just fear. It was pride wounded, and pride rarely spared lives. When she reached the cave, her breath caught in her throat. The warrior was still there, but the air felt different, charged with a tension that made her skin prickle. He watched her enter, his gaze burning in the flicker of the torch. She sank to her knees near him, her voice shaking. "They're coming again. Tomorrow, maybe sooner. I don't know how much longer." Her words faltered. She wanted to tell him she couldn't lose him, though she didn't know why. She wanted to promise she would protect him, though she had no power to keep such a vow. Instead, she reached out and pressed her hand to the rope around his wrist. His skin was warm beneath her fingers, rough with calluses, alive in a way that grounded her when everything else felt like it was slipping away. His lips moved, slow and deliberate, shaping words in his own tongue. She could not understand, yet the rhythm of his voice settled deep inside her. Then, after a pause, he spoke again, this time in halting English. The syllables broken, but clear enough to make her heart stop. "You choose." The two words echoed in the cave, louder than the crackle of fire, louder than the rush of her own heartbeat. She stared at him, her mouth dry, unable to answer. He was right. No matter how long she delayed, the choice would come, and it would be hers to bear. That night she lingered too long, leaving only when the first pale threads of dawn reached across the hills. On her way back, she saw movement near the ridge to riders cresting the trail, their figures dark against the sky. She dropped low, hiding among the brush, her pulse thundering as their voices carried through the cold morning air. They spoke of tracks, of signs they thought they had seen near the caves. One laughed harshly, saying they'd flush out whatever was hiding there soon enough. She waited until they were gone, her body trembling before she crept back to the village. Every step felt heavier, every sound sharper, as though the land itself was warning her of what was coming. By the time she reached her door, her decision weighed so heavy she could hardly breathe. The day passed slowly. She tried to keep to her tasks, but her hands fumbled, spilling grain, dropping a kettle lid, burning her finger on the stove. Her neighbors glanced at her strangely, some with pity, others with suspicion. She heard two women whispering near the well, their words cutting sharp. "She's not right, always wandering, always gone. Mark my words, something's not as it should be." She hurried away. But their voices followed her like shadows. That evening, as darkness closed over the village, she set out once more. The wind carried the scent of wood smoke and something sharper, anticipation, perhaps, or fear. She clutched her shawl tighter and walked swiftly. The path to the cave etched in her memory like the lines of her own hand. Inside, the warrior was waiting. His eyes met hers, steady, unwavering, as though he had been listening for her steps. She moved closer, her hands trembling as she pulled a small bundle from her basket. Inside was bread, yes, but also a coil of water-soaked cloth she had hidden beneath her skirt. She pressed it against the ropes at his wrists, softening them slowly, his breath hitched faintly. The first crack in his calm, but he did not move. He simply watched her, the silence between them filled with something too strong for words. She worked quickly, her heart pounding with every sound from the cave's mouth, every rustle of wind that might be footsteps. The ropes loosened beneath her hands. She stopped before finishing, her chest heaving, her eyes locked on his. "If I do this, everything changes," she whispered. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The truth was already clear. The air in the cave felt tight, as though the earth itself held its breath. She drew her hand back, staring at the half-frayed rope, and the knife gleamed faintly in the shadows between them. Outside, the wind carried a distant sound, hoof-beats again, faint but closing. Her blood ran cold. They were coming sooner than she thought. She turned back to him, her voice barely a breath. "They'll be here tonight." For the first time, his gaze flickered not with fear, but with something fiercer, resolve. He tilted his head toward the knife, then back to her, as if asking the question once more without words. The cave seemed to shrink around them. Every heart beat louder, every second heavier. The storm she had feared for so long had finally reached the ridge, and the choice she had tried to delay now pressed against her with no mercy. Outside, the hoofbeats grew louder. Voices echoed faintly through the rocks, calling to one another. The searchers were near. She looked at the warrior, at the ropes, at the knife glinting between them. Her hands shook as she reached for it, her breath shallow, her whole body caught between terror and certainty. The moment stretched, the weight of it pressing down with unbearable force. And then, just as the first torchlight flickered at the cave's mouth, she knew there was no time left to hesitate. The torchlight flickered at the cave's entrance. Orange against the cold night, shadows stretching long across the rocks. The woman's breath caught in her throat as voices rose outside. Men calling to one another, their boots crunching against stone. The warrior's eyes locked onto hers, steady even as the sound of danger pressed closer. In that heartbeat she lifted the knife from the dirt, her hand trembling but her resolve clear. The blade cut through the damp rope, the fibers snapping one by one until his wrist was free, then the other. The warrior pulled his arms down, the motion rough but controlled. For the first time she saw him without the burden of bindings, his chest rising as though he could finally breathe again. The sound of footsteps drew nearer, and she knew there was no chance to turn back. He caught her hand in his, firm and certain, and together they moved deeper into the cave's shadows, just as the men stepped inside. Torches flared against the walls, their light spilling across the place where he had once been tied. The loosened rope still hung from the beam, swaying faintly. A murmur of confusion rippled through the men as they raised their rifles, scanning the cavern. She pressed herself against the cool stone, the warrior's grip anchoring her, his silence commanding patience. They waited, hearts pounding in rhythm. With the approaching danger, until the men turned their attention toward the far side of the cavern, at his signal, they slipped into a narrow passage she had never noticed before, the darkness swallowing them whole. The hidden path twisted and narrowed, the air cold and damp. She stumbled, but his hand steadied her, guiding her through the maze of stone. Behind them, the echoes of the searchers' voices faded until only silence remained. At last, the narrow walls widened, and they emerged into the open air. The sky above filled with stars so bright it seemed the earth itself held its breath. For a moment she could not move, the relief crashing over her in waves. She turned to him, her voice shaking. "Where now?" He lifted his gaze toward the distant horizon where the ridges rolled into darker hills. "Home," he said again, the word clearer now, filled with meaning. They began the long walk together, the ground uneven beneath their feet, the night wind cutting sharp against their skin. She did not know where he would lead her or what they would face. But with each step her fear lessened, replaced by a quiet strength she had not known she carried. By dawn they reached a ridge that overlooked the valley, the village visible in the distance, smoke rising from chimneys like thin threads against the sky. She stood there a long while, her heart torn. That had been her world, the place where her name and history were rooted. But she knew she could not return, not after what she had done, not after the choice she had made. The villagers would see her as a traitor, and perhaps in their eyes she was. But as she looked at the man beside her, free at last, she understood that what bound her now was stronger than fear. The warrior led her deeper into the hills, where the land grew wilder and the paths less known. They traveled for days, moving carefully, sometimes through silence, sometimes through gestures that bridged the space between their languages. Slowly, he began to share more words, halting but clear. She learned fragments of his story, that he had been taken by men who wore uniforms, soldiers who had sought to break him by binding him in that cave, leaving him to weaken or die. But his spirit had endured, waiting for the chance that finally came the night she stepped inside. In turn, she shared pieces of herself. She spoke of her husband, gone too soon, of the emptiness that had followed, of the loneliness that no amount of work could fill. She spoke of the way the village walls had felt smaller each year, the way the wind across the prairie had always whispered that life held something more. He listened, his eyes steady on hers, and though he said little, she could feel the weight of his understanding. At last they came to a small valley, hidden among cliffs where a stream cut clean through the earth. Here he stopped, his gaze softening. As he touched the bark of a tree, the earth beneath his hands, this place, she realized, meant something to him. Whether it was part of his people's land or simply a refuge he had once known, it was clear that here he found peace. He turned to her then, speaking a word in his own tongue, then repeating it slowly in hers. Home. Her chest ached at the sound, not from sorrow, but from the strange fullness of it. She had given him a name when he was bound. Now he gave her something greater, a place where she too might belong. Time passed in that hidden valley, and though it was not without hardship, there was a quiet strength in the life they began to build. She learned to gather and grind, to listen to the land as he did. He, in turn, listened to her stories of the village, of the way fire was kept through the coldest nights, of songs sung softly while bread rose on the hearth. A life that was neither hers alone nor his, but something new, shaped by both. Yet the world beyond did not vanish. Riders sometimes passed far off, smoke sometimes rose in the distance, reminders that conflict still churned between settlers and Apache. She knew the dangers were not gone, that one day they might face questions, or worse, from both sides. But she also knew that the bond forged in that cave, in firelight and silence, would not break easily. When the first winter snow fell, she stood at the edge of the valley, watching the flakes drift down, quiet as feathers. The warrior came to her side, his presence warm and steady. For a moment she thought of the village again, the whispers, the suspicion, the narrow streets filled with smoke. She thought of the life she might have had if she had stayed, small and safe but empty. Then she looked at him and she knew she had chosen rightly. In the end, the story was not one of rescue alone, nor of escape. It was a story of two souls who had been bound in different ways, one by rope, the other by solitude, and who had found freedom not in breaking away from the world, but in finding each other. The land around them stretched wide and untamed, filled with both danger and promise. The wind carried the cry of hawks overhead, the rush of water below, the whisper of grass bending with the season. And standing there side by side, they both understood that home was not a place given or taken, but something built, fragile and strong, in the hearts that chose to carry it together. The torchlight, the ropes, the fear, they were memories now woven into the larger truth of what they had found. The woman who had once walked alone through the village streets now stood with the man who had once been bound in silence. There lives no longer separate paths but one. And as the snow fell soft across the valley, the story settled into its quiet ending, not with the sound of rifles or the echo of battle, but with the simple truth that even in the harshest of times, there are bonds strong enough to outlast fear, and names strong enough to outlive silence.